hunger strike is a method of non-violent resistance which one can take part in which the participant refuses to eat any food or drink until their eventual death. Historically, there are early stories of hunger striking dating back to pre-Christian Ireland, when people would fast on the doorstep of the person who had wronged them. To allow someone to die on your doorstep in Ireland was considered a great dishonour at that time. In more recent history, in the early 1900s, British and American suffragettes took part in hunger strikes while incarcerated in prison. In many cases, the British government would subject hunger strikers to force feedings. It would be a long time before force feeding would be classified as a form of torture. On the island of Ireland, hunger strikes took place during the 1916 to 1923 revolutionary period. In 1917, Irish Republican Thomas Ashe was incarcerated in Dublin's Mountjoy prison, where he demanded prisoner of war status. As part of his protest, he went on hunger strike, and was then force-fed. He died a short time later as a result of the force feeding, causing congestion in his lungs. When it came to force feeding, there was some significant risk involved, as sometimes the tube forced down the throat of the prisoner went into the lungs instead of the stomach. In 1920, the mayor of the Irish city of Cork, Terence McSweeney, died after 74 days on hunger strike while in a British prison. His case gained worldwide attention. At the end of the Irish Civil War in 1923, upwards of 8,000 IRA prisoners went on hunger strike to protest their continued detention by the Irish Free State, and 2 people lost their lives during this protest. Though everything I've talked about thus far doesn't exactly pertain to the Troubles, it's important to understand that hunger striking as a form of protest was steeped in the history of the people of Ireland. That brings us to the period of Northern Irish history known as the Troubles. The 1981 hunger strike was one of the most important events in the history of the Troubles. But in reality, the hunger strike was the culmination of a 5-year protest. And in this episode, we will learn about how it came to be, what happened during that time, and the implications of what happened in the aftermath. This is the Troubles podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. During the 70s in Northern Ireland, hundreds of people were arrested on suspicion of taking part in paramilitary activity. Many of those who ended up in prison were of the opinion that they were not carrying out acts of criminality, but rather they were prisoners of war. This was a common issue throughout the Troubles. The British government would continually deny that a war was taking place, whereas many Irish Republicans considered the Troubles a war, and that their campaign of violence was purely political. This violence would not be happening if not for a political aim. After a meeting with the Provisional IRA in 1972, the Conservative British government's Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, William Whiteclaw, granted special category status to all prisoners serving sentences in Northern Ireland for Troubles-related offences. This was essentially granting them prisoner of war, or POW status. So what does that mean? I've touched on it briefly before, but it means that the prisoners do not have to wear prison uniforms or do prison work. They were also housed together within their paramilitary factions, and they were allowed extra visits and food parcels. Special category status remained in place until 1976, after it was argued that it was undermining the role of the prison authorities in maintaining discipline. The word criminalisation becomes important here. Criminalisation means the action of turning an activity into a criminal offence by making it illegal, and the British government wanted to withdraw support for the IRA and the Republicans from the greater Catholic community. Essentially, the British government was saying, these people are not engaged in a political struggle. They are simply criminals. So after March 1976, anyone who was convicted of any crime, paramilitary or otherwise, would be treated as an ordinary prisoner, having to wear uniforms and do prison work. Prisoners who were already given special category status could retain it, but all new prisoners would not be receiving it. The ending of special category status was a PR blow to the IRA, and also threatened the authority which paramilitary leaderships enjoyed while in prison. Under special category status, Republican and Loyalist prisoners could gather together in their own separate factions, and there is footage of loyalist prisoners marching in step together while in prison. To protest the removal of this status, IRA leaders inside the prison sent word to the IRA on the outside saying that they could begin assassinating prison officers. Over the next 5 years, from 1976 on, 19 prison officers would lose their lives. This would also lead to many officers resenting the Republican prisoners. During the research for this episode, I came across many accounts of prison officers attacking prisoners. Kieran Heather Nugent was a member of the Provisional IRA who was arrested after hijacking a bus. He was the first Republican prisoner to be sentenced since the revoking of special category status. He was sent to the newly renamed Maze Prison, which had previously been called the Longkesh Detention Centre. The prison had seen significant development, with the construction of 8 H blocks where prisoners were housed. I talk in detail about these H blocks during the Maze Prison escape back in Season 1 if you want to hear more. But back to Kieran. On September 14th, 1976, Kieran began a blanket protest. That meant that he and other IRA or INLA prisoners would refuse to wear their prison uniforms, or as they referred to them, monkey suits. Instead, wrapping themselves up in blankets from their beds, or choosing to be naked. Because of this, he wasn't allowed to leave his cell or to get any visitors. Those taking part in the protest became known as the Blanketmen. By 1978, there were upwards of 150 prisoners taking part in the protest, with that number continuing to rise. As the protest continued, the British government showed no signs of conceding to the prisoners' demands. Then in April of that year, a fight broke out between a prisoner and a prison officer. The prisoner was taken away to solitary confinement and word got out to the other prisoners that he had been beaten. The Republican prisoners were furious and smashed all the furniture in their cells in protest. They then refused to leave their cells or empty out their chamber pots. In this way, the blanket protest soon developed into a dirty protest. Each Republican prisoner had a chamber pot in their cells that needed to be slopped out by the guards every day. The Republican prisoners began refusing to slop out, and they began to smear their excrement all over the walls of the cells.
We're political prisoners! We want political status! We're political prisoners! Political status! Give me that blanket, man!
One ex-Blanketman explained that they used to just let the excrement pile up in a corner of the cell, but the smell soon became unbearable. So instead, they would smear it all over the walls, and it would dry there and the stench would be slightly less offensive. Richard O'Raw is the author of the book Blanketmen, which details his personal account of his time as a senior IRA prisoner in the H blocks during the protests. He eventually became press officer for the hunger strikers. I'll be referencing his book throughout this episode and also talking about criticisms of O'Raw's account of the events. In his book, he described, quote, "The point of our protest was to make the conditions in the wings so appallingly unhygienic that sympathy for our plight would grow throughout Ireland." Richard goes on to describe what life was like during the dirty protests. Quote, "At the start, the no-wash protest was intensely difficult. I had grown a huge ginger beard and my hair was tumbling down my back. But not to wash was repugnant to me. After 2 weeks, my hair was in tats and sticking to my back with grease. I had great trouble with the smell of the rotting food, mostly cold porridge which we threw in the corner, and the shit that we smeared on the walls, with pieces of foam from our mattresses. The more foam we tore from our mattresses, the smaller our sleeping area became, and we had to sleep in a fixed position because there was very little foam left. It was difficult not to feel like I was being buried alive in a sewer." Richard's account of time in the cells is quite graphic, and he talks about how bad things got, such as the time that maggots appeared from all the rotting food left in the cells. He also described beatings by prison guards, cavity searches, as well as forcible washing. Outside of the prison, the Republican movement was out organising protests and also trying to get the more moderate nationalists to care about the Republican prisoners. Initially, the protests failed to gather much momentum, but things gradually started to change. There was a lot of paramilitary violence in 1979. It was also the year that the IRA killed the Queen's cousin, Lord Mountbatten, as well as 18 British soldiers in an incident known as the Warren Point ambush. Both of these incidents happened in the same day. It was also the year that Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Thatcher was a heavy-handed Conservative leader, and she was disliked in Great Britain for a number of her policies. She was also nicknamed the Iron Lady for her uncompromising politics and leadership style. She was the one at the forefront of the decision-making process when it came to returning this status to the prisoners. She had no interest in ceding ground to the IRA and argued that all crime should be treated the same.
There can be no question of political status for someone who is serving a sentence for crime. Crime is crime is crime. It is not political, it is crime.
That same year, her friend, politician Eire Neve, had also been assassinated by the INLA, so she would have had a hard time having any sympathy for Republican prisoners. Realising that their dirty protest wasn't enough, the Republican prisoners then set about planning the next step of their protest, which would take the form of a hunger strike.
We and my 6 comrades are prepared to go through with this, and we are prepared to die to prove that we are special prisoners and our 5 basic demands are just.
IRA leadership on the outside were against the idea of a hunger strike and didn't think Thatcher would break. So it would be too dangerous for those involved. The Blanketmen had 5 demands, which were: 1. The right not to wear prison uniform. 2. The right not to do prison work. 3. The right to free association with other prisoners and to organise educational and recreational events. 4. The right to 1 visit, 1 letter and 1 parcel per week. And 5. Full restoration of remission lost through the protest. Remission means that a prisoner's sentence could be reduced as much as 50% as a result of good behaviour. Blanketmen lost all rights to remission. When it came to the decision-making process in the Provisional IRA, it was complicated. At the centre of this situation were the men who were taking part in the hunger strike. Then above them were the operational commander, or OC, of the Republican prisoners inside the prison. This OC was different to the OC Senior Council on the outside. Sometimes the British government communicated with the OC on the outside, and sometimes with the men inside the prison. Once on hunger strike, the men didn't have that much decision-making power, though this has been disputed. Their only job was to survive as long as possible. They could withdraw at any time, but in most cases they were entirely devoted to their cause, or not willing to let their friends down by backing down. This factor comes into play more during the second hunger strike. Brendan Hughes, who was known as the Dark, was a member of the Provisional IRA who was incarcerated in Maze Prison and was Operation Commander, or OC, of the Blanketmen. He would have been one of the more senior members managing the protests. Hughes had lobbied with a senior council member outside of the prison to begin a hunger strike, but they refused, believing that all avenues that might bring about a settlement had not yet been explored. Bick McFarlane was also another prominent Republican prisoner who would have been involved in the decision-making process while in prison. Against the wishes of the IRA on the outside, Hughes and 6 others began the first hunger strike on October 27, 1980. This timing was significant because it would mean that the men would start dying around Christmas time, traditionally a time of goodwill, and he believed that it would shed the British government in a bad light to allow prisoners to die during Christmas time. 148 prisoners volunteered to take part, but in the end 7 were selected, 6 IRA men and 1 representing another Republican paramilitary group, the INLA. The number 7 was significant to the Republicans, as this was the same number of people that signed the Easter 1916 Declaration of the Republic, and there was hope that this would help bring the strike to the attention of the people in the Republic of Ireland, who had been somewhat apathetic. There was some criteria that needed to be considered when selecting who would take part in the hunger strikes. The location of the men was important, and no two men from the same area were selected to maximise the support coming from the outside. In this way, all 6 counties in Northern Ireland were represented during the strike. As well as that, it would be important that the men selected would have the mental fortitude to see the strike through to the end. It would also be important that the men selected were in full health. Anyone with any health issues would not be allowed to take part in the strike. Finally, it was important that any men selected hadn't been involved in any activity that was deemed too violent. Because the IRA wanted people to advocate for the men on the outside, it was important that they were in prison for a relatively non-violent crime. But this wasn't always the case. For example, Bick McFarlane had volunteered to take part in the first and second strike, but had been refused because of his charge. Bick was connected to the Bayardo bar attack, which saw 5 people lose their lives, 4 of which were Protestant civilians, and 1 being a UVF member. As Hughes was the one leading the hunger strike, he could not act as Bloc OC, so that role went to a relatively unknown IRA man at the time, called Bobby Sands. Robert Sands was born on March 9, 1954. Growing up, Sands and his family had to relocate numerous times after being intimidated out of their home by loyalists. Sands joined the Provisional IRA in 1972 at the age of 18. He was first arrested that very same year after being caught in possession of 4 handguns. He was released from prison in 1976 and immediately resumed his activities within the IRA. That same year, he was implicated in the bombing of the Balmoral Furniture Company in Dunmurry. As they left the scene, Sands and some other men were involved in a shootout with the Royal Ulster Constabulary. The men tried to escape in the car but were caught and arrested. Sands was then sentenced to serve 14 years behind bars for possession of a revolver which was found in their car. In prison, Sands became quite popular amongst Republican prisoners. He wrote a lot and often contributed to the Sinn Féin newspaper on the outside, writing articles in tiny handwriting on tissue paper, which was then smuggled out of the prison. Inside the prison, he entertained the prisoners with his stories, poetry, and guitar playing. Sands also volunteered to take part in the first hunger strike, but there was another man from Belfast already taking part, so he was unable to. He did then take Hughes's place as OC once the hunger strike began. 2 months into the strike, 3 Republican women in Armagh Women's Prison joined the protest. One of those women was Mairead Farrell, who I talked about before in the Gibraltar episode. During the strike, the prison guards tried to tempt the strikers to break their strike by bringing warm, enticing meals into their cells, but it was no use. The strike slowly began to draw attention, and there were protests and marches throughout Northern Ireland and some in the Republic of Ireland as well. The 7 were also encouraged by outside command to drink 8 pints of water a day to maintain their strength, and they also made sure to ingest a small amount of salt, which helped the men survive as long as possible. The lack of food took effect on the men very quickly, and within a few weeks the strikers had aged significantly as the weight drained from their bodies. At night in the cells, the prisoners who weren't on hunger strike spent the hours singing and reading poetry out to the strikers to try and keep morale up. The men would also communicate in the Irish language Gaeilge, so the prison guards could not understand them. After a few weeks, the strikers were moved from their cells to the prison hospital. I'll just take a quick pause here to explain why the prisoners were not force-fed. In the early days of the Troubles, force-feeding was still a practice that went on. In the mid-1970s, Dolores and Marion Price were serving a sentence in England after being convicted of the Old Bailey bombing. They went on hunger strike, and a decision was eventually made to force-feed them in 1974. It was an incredibly traumatic process, in which Marion likened to rape. A wooden block was stuffed into their mouths to prevent them from biting down. A rubber tube was then inserted into a hole in the block, and hopefully down into the stomach. A slurry-type mixture was then poured down the tube. Like I mentioned earlier, force-feeding could often lead to accidents. Such may be the case of Michael Gaughan, who was an IRA member in prison on the Isle of Wight. He had been taking part in a hunger strike and died. The British government claimed that he died from pneumonia, though his family claim he died as a result of complications from force-feeding. Force-feeding was eventually declared unethical by the World Medical Association in 1975. and after enough public outcry, the British government stopped using it altogether. Now back to the first hunger strike. Just 2 months into the first hunger strike, the British government sent an intermediary to Hughes, and it appeared that there was the possibility of a compromise. Though this was done covertly, publicly they remained silent. Shortly after, one of the strikers, Sean McKenna, began lapsing in and out of a coma, and was on the brink of death. Hughes had made a promise to McKenna that he would call off the hunger strike if he fell into a coma. But he was torn because he had not yet received a document from the British government outlining their proposed terms. As well as that, the men had not eaten food in over 50 days and were deteriorating rapidly by this point, losing hearing, sight, and the ability to walk. From what I've read, it seems that the average length of time one can survive without food is between 60 to 70 days. So time was rapidly running out for the men. After 53 days without food, Hughes called off the strike on December 18th, choosing to save McKenna's life over laying his eyes on the final document from the British government. There was a great sense of relief amongst the prisoners that no one had died. The document from the British government was eventually received, but it was a far cry from what the prisoners were expecting to get. It was vague and open to interpretation and full of holes. For example, civilian clothing could only be worn during visits with family, and then the prisoners could wear civilian type clothing issued by the prison officials while doing prison work. It would also not lead to the restating of the special category status. There was an extremely low morale left in the prison in the wake of the end of the strike, as many felt it didn't accomplish anything. But the prisoners were advised to keep up a cheerful appearance when their family were visiting, so as to appear as if they were successful in their demands. In the wake of the first strike, the prisoners talked about what they could do afterwards. There was talk of them going back into the prison system and wearing their uniforms, then trying to wreak havoc. But this was shot down, as it would mean that the blanket and dirty protests were for nothing. O'Raw describes in his book, Blanketmen, that after one evening of lengthy discussion between the prisoners in their cells, there was silence before Bobby Sands spoke in Irish. He said, "Sin é, Irash an Stailc Ucras." In English, this means, that's it, back on hunger strike. Bobby Sands, as OC of the prisoners, had the final say in the matter and agreed that the only way forward was a second hunger strike. The men were well aware that this time there would definitely be deaths involved. That's it for this episode. See you next week. The Patreon is a great way to show your support. I release the episodes there early, and I also put out a companion video with each episode. On Patreon, the episodes are also completely ad-free, and you can listen on your own personal RSS feed on your podcast player. I'll also be posting there the full show notes for every episode. You can support the podcast over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. Alternatively, if you'd like to support the podcast in a once-off fashion, you can do that over at buymeacoffee.com/The Troubles Podcast. You can also support the podcast by leaving reviews or simply telling your friends. It all helps.